君はの中の茨の花かさゆいゆいこれで帰ればやれほにままならぬまたはりのちんならかのさまよさとろならいざよいつきよさゆいゆい二人で気がねもやれほに水いらずまたはりのちんならかのさまよ君はの中の茨の花かさゆいゆいこれで帰ればやれほにままならぬまたはりのちんならかのさまよさとろならいざよいつきよさゆいゆい二人で気がねもやれほに水いらずまたはりのちんならかのさまよ
Okay, can we hear me now? Okay, sorry about that. First, thank you very much to Wesley Uenten, Francis Wong, and Scott Oshiro for the lovely opening music, Asado ya Yunta, which is a very famous song in Okinawa for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. I want to welcome everyone to the Okinawa Memory Initiative's reflections on the 50th anniversary of the Koza Uprising. I'm Alan Christie, director of the Okinawa Memories Initiative, and an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. 日本語のビジターに対して、このウェビナーには通訳の選択ができます。Zoom の窓のメニューバーに Interpretation というアイコンにクリックすれば日本語が選べられます。
You can choose the interpretation icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen.
The land acknowledgement statement by one of our longtime members, Alexis McClellan Ufugusku. Lex?
ナビラグスヨチュヌアチマリニヘデビルワンネマクラレンウフグスクレックスヤイビンワンオバンワタウヤファフジアツカザンカラチャビタンユタサルグトゥウニゲサビラ Hi everyone, I'm Lex. I'm a third year in the PhD program in history here, and I study Okinawan Ryukyu in history. And I am super excited and honored to be allowed to read the land acknowledgement. The University of California, Santa Cruz is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and to heal from historical trauma.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lex. Our guests will be speaking in either English or Japanese. The program is available with simultaneous interpretation in either language. To choose your preferred language, locate the interpretation icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. Click on it and choose your language. When the speakers are speaking the language you have chosen, you will hear them directly. When they're speaking the language for which you need interpretation, you will hear just our interpreters. We're so happy to be able to provide our audience with a comfortable access to today's program. Events like this don't just fall into place. Instead, many people have done wonderful work to make this possible, and I'd like to begin with some thank yous. Thank you to the special events team at UC Santa Cruz for all the technical and planning support they provided prior to and during this event. Thank you to the Humanities Institute at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where the Okinawa Memories Initiative has its home and administrative support. The Humanities Institute is a wonderful place to incubate new ideas for new projects and events, and we have benefited from their strong support for many years. Thank you to the Tokyo Broadcasting System, TBS, which has given us permission to include one of their talents, Kubota Tomoko, in tonight's events. And while I am at it, let me acknowledge that this event was first proposed to us by Kubota-san, whose participation in Okinawa Memories Initiative research fieldwork over the last couple of years has been a tremendous gift. Thank you to the wonderful undergraduate students who staff the events and communications team, who have worked hard to develop this event and communicate about it through our social media. Edie Troutwine, Kimberly Zito, Emily Aranda, Jared Guzman, and Mickey Arlen. And thank you as well to team members Drew Richardson and Marcy Flynn for shooting and editing video of the neighborhood in Koza as it is today. Thank you to our guests, Kuniyoshi Kazuo, Stan Rushworth, and Wesley Uenten for giving us your time and insights. And thank you to Chiyomori and Miki Watanabe for their interpretation work today. Thanks as always to the people of Okinawa and the United States who have shared their time and their stories with us. We're honored to serve our communities. And finally, thank you to all of you who have joined us today, and especially those who have shared our announcements and have thereby helped us reach as wide an audience as possible. As director of this project, I am humbled by the support and so grateful to you all. And one last thing before we get started. Our event is presented in the webinar format of Zoom. That means that you, our guests, will not be visible on our screens, and the chat feature of Zoom is disabled. We welcome any questions you have for our question and answer period at the end of our presentations. To submit a question, either in English or in Japanese, please use the Q&A function visible at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We are recording this event and will make it available on our website at okinawamemories.org. So our program will feature 3 conversations between a member of the Okinawa Memories Initiative team and a special guest. We will begin with a conversation between Kubota Tomoko and Kuniyoshi Kazuo. Mr. Kunioshi worked for many years as a photographer for the Ryukyu Shinpo, one of the major newspapers in Okinawa. The night of the Koza Uprising, he was called out by his editors to document what was going on. He will talk with us about conditions in Okinawa prior to the events of December 20th, 1970, to help us understand the sources of the anger that erupted that night, give us his eyewitness account, and talk about the legacies of the uprising in Okinawa. Our second conversation will be between Dr. Dustin Wright, Associate Director of the Okinawa Memories Initiative, and Assistant Professor in the School of World Languages and Cultures at California State University, Monterey Bay, and Stan Rushworth, an American Army veteran, memoirist, and writing teacher at Cabrillo College here in Santa Cruz County. Mr. Rushworth will talk about his experiences as a soldier stationed in Okinawa during the Vietnam War. Finally, Alexis McClellan Ufugusku, a PhD student in history at UC Santa Cruz, will speak with Dr. Wesley Uenten, professor in the Asian American Studies Department at San Francisco State University and former president of the Okinawa Association of America in Northern California. They will speak about the legacy and meanings of the Koza Uprising for Okinawans in diaspora and offer commentary for thinking about the Koza Uprising in the present context of race relations and protest in the United States. Following these presentations, we will have a Q&A period for the audience to ask our guests any questions you have. And with that, I'll set the stage with a brief account of the late night to early morning of December 20th, 1970 in Okinawa in the middle of the Vietnam-American War. 50 years ago today, the often rocky relationship between Okinawans and the US military took a major blow as an Okinawan protest turned violent for the first time in the 25 years of American control of the islands. The protest came to be known as the Koza Riot. We, however, will call it the Koza Uprising, following Okinawan scholars such as Anya Masaaki and our own guest, Wesley Uenten. Calling it an uprising focuses our attention on the political conditions that drove the protesters to violence. The protest was sparked by an accident. An American, driving drunk, hit an Okinawan man who was walking across the street at about 1 a.m. in the city of Koza. Koza was a busy entertainment and shopping district that especially catered to servicemen and their families living on the bases surrounding the area. Since the accident took place just after Saturday night turned into Sunday morning, the streets were still alive with people, even at that late hour. The pedestrian was hurt, although not severely, and a crowd quickly formed at the scene of the accident and grew increasingly agitated as police and then MPs arrived to investigate. Just 1 week earlier, another American who had killed an Okinawan woman in a drunk driving incident in the town of Itoman had been let off by a military court and removed from the island. With that fresh evidence of the unaccountability of the American military, the crowd in Koza was determined not to let this accident follow the same path. As anger boiled over, people stopped passing cars driven by Americans, removed and often beat their passengers. Through the rest of the night, they flipped and burned cars parked on the side of the road or in nearby parking lots. Staff working in the area's bars offered Coke and beer bottles filled with gasoline from a nearby gas station as Molotov cocktails. Eventually, thousands of protesters faced off against hundreds of police and MPs. They moved through the major streets of Koza, carefully designating the objects of their wrath by virtue of the fact that license plates differentiated between American and Okinawan owners. One group even stormed Gate 2 of Kadena Air Base, burning a couple of buildings there. In the end, over 60 cars were burned, and dozens of people were injured and arrested. And thankfully, there were no deaths. The next day, a couple of American newspapers reported on what authorities were calling the riots, but coverage quickly disappeared from American newspapers. However, the absence of media of further reporting on the uprising does not mean that it was insignificant or merely momentary. This was an event that was in some ways spontaneous, and in another, the explosion of long smoldering embers. Many things contributed to this night of rage, and our guests will all talk to those issues. And with that long introduction, I would like to now turn the program over to Kubota Tomoko and Kuniyoshi Kazuo, who will speak to us from Okinawa
ありがとうございます。
in Koza.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Hi, everyone. Can you see this? Not yet. Good morning, everyone. This is Tomoko Kubota, December 20th. Right now, it's 9:45, 9:50 a.m. in Japan. This is Koza in Okinawa Prefecture in Japan. It's really quiet. 50 years ago, around this time, there were a lot of cars, a lot of people in the same area. So I'm going to talk to somebody who actually eyewitnessed the event 50 years ago, and then I'm going to walk around the area to introduce the area for you. So this is Kunioshi. Can you hear me? Yes, I can. Hi, nice to meet you. So I'm going to introduce Kunioshi-san's background quickly.
I'd like a slide, please. 国吉さんですけれども、琉球新報でカメラマン。
Mr. Kuniyoshi was the photojournalist for Ryukyu Shinpo. He is still a photojournalist. So when Koza Uprising occurred, he ran to the area and then took pictures. So for this part, back then, he's going to talk about how things were back in Okinawa. So let's see if we can virtually experience the little walk in the town of Koza. So this is Kuniyoshi. So right now, where I'm sitting is by the number 2 gate of the Kadena Air Force Base, U.S. Air Force Base. And I'm sitting in history. This is the second gate right here. And then this wide road here, that is called Gate Street. And the Koza Uprising actually spread to this area as well. And then so I'm hoping we can take a little stroll here on the Gate Street. So here right now, coming out from the second gate, and then we're on the left side of the Gate Street. So here 50 years ago, how was it around here? So the buildings are about the same. It looks the same, but there were a lot of signs in English back then. And then, like even in the mornings, you would see a lot of U.S. soldiers walking around here down the street. And 50 years ago, December 20th, they had Christmas vacations. And then most people got about 1 week, but for some people got like 1 month, 1 full month of Christmas vacation. And then I think 20th was probably one of the first days of their long vacation. And from each store, you could see all the Christmas songs, carols, like White Christmas, Jingle Bells. And then you can see Christmas decorations. And then I can still picture that night, people walking down the street with those Christmas decorations, local people, US soldiers, and then you can see, we will continue on with the next slide.
The photo, there's a boy on the car. は
この
い、こちら
写真、
ですね。
So this picture,
好きな写真なんです。
so this is one of my favorites
騒動が来て暴動が
for sure. So after the uprising, maybe after about 10 hours, this was the next morning,
米兵が焼き出された車を一箇所に集めて、
and then the US soldiers actually put all the burnt cars in one place.
各地から見学に来たわけです。
And then a lot of people actually came to see the situation.
沖縄市、コザ市、あの当時コザ市ですけど。
So back then, Koza City, not Okinawa City, but back then Koza City
車だけが燃やされたというんで、日曜日と
became really famous over this news. And that boy you saw, he just kind of hopped on the hood of the car. And then he had maybe 1 or 2 steps on the car and then jumped off right away. So all these cars with US license plates and a boy standing on top of one car. That was very symbolic. So he was probably like 8 years old back then. So he must have been like 58, 59, maybe just before 60 right now by then. So I can see Banzai here on the car. And then so feels like this symbolizes this sort of like a clear, sort of a refreshing feeling of the local people in Okinawa in this word, Banzai. And then in the morning, there were a lot of people gathered around the scene. So this uprising, so in Okinawan language, it was a well done, good job. There was a word for it to describe this event. And then the local people in Okinawa had been suffering from all these mistreatment, all these traffic accidents being sort of brushed under the rug. Nobody's been punished. I think this riot, this uprising actually helped them feel a little bit better about their identity, their local ideas. So there are 2 aspects, I think, in the background leading to this uprising. And then if you see this, there were several incidents leading up to this Koza uprising. So the first one is the nerve gas not being removed as promised. And this gas was prepared and stored in Okinawa for Vietnam. And also vicious military crimes by the US Army soldiers, US Air Force soldiers. They would cause some troubles or commit crimes, but they weren't punished for what they did. So the Kagoshima Prefecture, Satsuma, came to Okinawa and they keep it under control before the World War II. And then in 1945, in April, US military landed Okinawa. And then that included Iwo as well. And then that was the land fight. And then Okinawa is the only place where civilians were involved in the war. So with the US military invasion into Okinawa, they kept entire Okinawa area under control, military control.
琉球侵略とか、それから明治
So Okinawa experienced invasion into Ryukyu Kingdom in the 1600, and then they had other types of invasion throughout the history. And then when you add up all the time they were under some type of control or military control, it's a long history, long time that the local people suffered. So I think all these history or historical background actually led to the Koza Uprising. So here there's the delegate from Japan and US, and then also a representative of the Okinawa government or Ryukyu government back then. And so you can see these three men here with different aims, different missions. But Kunio-san repeatedly actually says that there was this serious issue of human rights violation in this area. Yes, you can see Mr. Sakase here. And to the left, Mr. Yara Chobyo, he was the Ryukyu, the representative of the Ryukyu. And the man in the middle is James Rampart from the States. And to the right is the delegate, a Japanese delegate, Mr. Takase. So then three men are looking at different way, different directions completely. And then they have different missions, different agenda. They're not on the same page. And then people in Okinawa in this area protested that US military is storing poison gas or nerve gas that they were planning to use in Vietnam War. And then they were hiding the fact they were storing those gas from local people. And then I took some pictures on this picture without thinking much, but then this was the first day actually in 1971 that they were actually transporting the poison gas, nerve gas. And then Mr. Lampert actually said, it described Okinawa as a jungle, and then they have to follow a jungle rule. And then there was a uprising or riot in Vietnam, similar to what happened in Koza. And then with this nerve gas incident, so this picture is related to the transportation of the nerve gas. And then I took some different pictures on the same day, but some other pictures actually. In those pictures, these three men are smiling. So that was kind of strange. So then background of this Koza Uprising. So we were sort of looking at the background, the history leading to this incident. And then now we would like to talk about what Kuniyoshi-san actually saw on that day of the uprising. So sorry, Kubota-san, I can't hear you right now. Can you hear me?
Alan, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Tomoko-san.
Okay,
Is it?
great, Dustin.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Dustin and Stan. Go ahead and start talking for us?
Okay, I just need someone to activate my video. I can't seem to do it. Okay.
Perfect.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening. Nihon ni iru minasan, ohayou gozaimasu. My name is Dustin Wright, and I'm an associate director of OMI and an assistant professor of Japanese culture and language at California State University, Monterey Bay. It is my pleasure to welcome to this event my good friend, Stan Rushworth. Stan was born during World War II and served in the military in Okinawa during the early years of the Vietnam War. He has lived and worked in Highland, Guatemala, Hawaii, and has been teaching English in Northern California for the last 30 years, with a focus on Indigenous issues. He is the author of Sam Wood's American Healing, Going to Water, The Journal of Beginning Rain, and most recently, Diaspora's Children, which just came out this fall. He is a citizen of the Chiricahua Apache Nation, is married, and is a grandfather. So Stan, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you very much. It's great to see you. Stan, if you don't mind, I want to begin by first reading a couple of sentences, again, from your new book that just came out, Diaspora's Children. Just a couple of sentences in your acknowledgements. So Stan writes, I also owe much gratitude to the people of Okinawa who took me in during a very hard time for all. They taught me about compassion, strength, resilience, and the deeper nature of shelter within Indigenous thought. Stan, just as a way to begin to talk about your experience, I wanted to ask why it was important for you to include that in your acknowledgements.
The book deals a great deal with my time on Okinawa. And I was brought up in early childhood in my grandfather's Indigenous household, and then was influenced as far away from that as the American educational institutions could bring me, because Indigenous thought here was quite frowned upon, to say the least. My grandfather's people were a colonized people. And so his way of life, our way of life, was not given the respect that it gave itself. So that all culminated for me when I arrived in Okinawa as a teenager in the military in August of 1963. And all of what was happening on a global scale at that time, I think really speaks a lot to what was happening on Okinawa between the military, US military, and the Okinawan people. So I think it's, in thinking about this event, what I ran into when I got to Okinawa was an incredible amount of fear. And fear has a nasty little brother called anger. And that anger creates hatred and creates dehumanization. All of those were very much what I ran into. I had come out of being on a missile site in San Francisco, in Pacifica, where during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were running armed patrols in the artichoke fields of San Francisco. Not too many people know this, but that's what was happening. The communist fear, the fear of communism, the Cold War, all of that was culminating and heading towards this conflict in Vietnam. So, and I think it's also important to realize that all of this is happening before Martin Luther King. It's happening really in a deep sense of racism being completely part of the society. In the military, racism and sexism both. The cadence, the military cadence songs were all sexist, to say the least. Crudely sexist. When I got to Okinawa, even before that, there was so much segregation between Blacks and whites and other people of color. People of color besides Blacks were always with the whites in terms of barracks, who was sleeping in what section of the barracks, and the Blacks were always segmented off. So all the racial epithets that you can imagine, the N-word, this word, that word, for every ethnicity were just commonplace, as well as the denigration of women, which is, in my experience, always part of a colonial dynamic. You know, whenever you have people that feel they're the conquering heroes, they always seem to fall to taking rights over women's lives. And that was very much present in Okinawa. The first week I was there, we were sleeping in our barracks. I was on Sukidan, and we were sleeping in our barracks because of race wars between Black and white soldiers. We had our lights on all night long with an armed guard with a 45 caliber submachine gun guarding over us all night long. This was from the first night I arrived on the island.
They're guarding you from they're basically guarding some soldiers from other soldiers.
Blacks and whites, that's correct. And we were told that a number of people had been killed. I've never been able to find any evidence of that, but that's what we were told. I still remember the face on the young man there, sweating all night long, you know, holding this 45 caliber submachine gun. So this kind of terror really was part and parcel of everything that was going on. The impunity that was happening, that was that Tomoko mentioned, and that Mr. Kunioshi mentioned, the violence against Okinawan women particularly, that went without any kind of punishment, very often without any kind of notice whatsoever. And I think a lot of women were hurt who never even stepped forward because they didn't feel that it would go anywhere, you know, and that it would cause a lot of problems in their life. There was a lot of reprisal at the time. Right outside of Sukuran, there was a couple of soldiers right after I got there were attacked by Okinawans, is the way it was put. And one of them ended up dead, the other near dead. And, you know, after what I began to see, I'm sure this was in reprisal for some kind of violence against Okinawan women or against Okinawan men. I saw this over and over and over again. In Naha, I was in a hotel one night, and the hotel owners roused me in the middle of the night and told me to get the heck out of there because a mob of people came in. I hesitate to use the word mob because it has bad connotations, but a large group of men came in looking for American soldiers to beat within an inch of their life. And I ran out the back door and they chased me down the street and I ran for my life. Same thing happened to me in Nago. I was up there in a ryokan and there was an incident I heard later between some Marines and an Okinawan and his wife, who was accosted by some Marines. The Okinawan man stood up. He was beaten very badly. And so a group of men came through every place in Nago to beat up American soldiers. The people at the ryokan I knew because I'd been there before, and they hid me in a closet and covered me with blankets, and probably 20, 30 guys went by with their feet inches away from my face under the blanket. So I'm sure those folks saved my life or saved me from a very severe beating. So this was a constant throughout the time that I was there. And when you look at this from a global perspective, I think you have to take into consideration, again, this is pre-civil rights movement. This is during a time of intense fear. It's also a time, I entered the military only 17 years after the end of World War II. So the whole kind of notion of having stopped Imperial Japan, I think was in a lot of young soldiers' minds. I know my father fought at Rabaul in the South Pacific. So a lot of our parents had stood up against an empire in Asia, right? And for a lot of native soldiers, indigenous soldiers, we were struggling with the fact that the empire at home was still stifling and oppressing our communities. So this is a really, really difficult thing. So I thank the Okinawan people for reminding me of the shelter in indigenous thought, indigenous perspectives, because that's what they did. I was there from August of '63 until April of '65 in Sukiran, most of that, and then on a special forces staging out area in the north, right on the other side of the island from Nago.
So that's for folks who aren't familiar, that's a pretty big spread of the main island of Okinawa. That's you were stationed down in the south where most of the bases are concentrated, but then you were also up in the north in that sort of northern, what at the time was a northern jungle training area, right?
Yeah, and I was fortunate while I was stationed in Sukidan, when I saw how crazy everything was and so much violence between the soldiers and the local folks, my duty was such that I was able to rent a home in Koza. So I lived in Koza with a family, a school teacher and his wife and two little girls right on the edge of Koza. So it was very interesting for me to see the pictures tonight, because when I was there in 1964, it was even more different than the pictures that we saw tonight. It was far less clubs and that kind of thing. It was much more of a town, I'd say. I practiced martial arts there on a side street in Koza with a man named Eizo Shimabuku. And you know, I spent a lot of time in Naha. I had to get away from the military. So I started learning Japanese, again, practicing martial arts, going into the off-limits areas in Naha. There was a great, back then, there were these music parlors where you could go in, get coffee. There may still be. There was one on Kokusayori, kind of downstairs, and I made friends with all the folks there. They were wonderful folks. And I wanted to thank, in writing this book, because so much of it happens on Okinawa, as a confrontation with notions of empire or imperialism and domination, and how that ties domination of the other, domination of someone who's country you feel the right to go into because of your superior civilization or whatever, how that involves women, how that, the nature of subjugation really is what the book is about, and how, and my experience with resisting that. Well, I could not have done that. I could not have survived the despair of that time. And of course, all of us were being nurtured to go into Vietnam also. And even though we were not officially in there, we were bombing Vietnam from there pretty much daily. Special forces camp I was on, there were A teams and B teams going in and out all the time that were reporting what was happening, which was that Americans were getting beaten very badly at that time. So all of this fear, I think, just created this incredible tension in the soldiers, which of course then they worked out on the local people. That's what happens, you know, in those kind of situations. So, you know, the family I lived with took good care of me. The folks at the music parlor, I spent a lot of time walking by myself, staying away from the soldiers. So I was in a lot of really small villages. I walked from where I was up the north up to Hedo. I met some children. The children were fantastic everywhere I went. They were trusting. You know, they were wary, they were watchful because I was an American soldier. But when I spoke a little of the language and we hung out together, the villages opened up to me and saw me as an individual person more than an American soldier. And I think that's what I'm thanking them for, you know, and to me, that's born of people who have been where they've been for 30,000 years, you know? So there's a certain security they feel in the land, which makes the violations of the land all that much more poignant. Well,
that's a wonderful sort of way to kind of circle back to that original question, Stan. Thank you so much for sharing this with us and helping us think through some of your perspective there and offering a little bit about what it was like to be on the base, what it was like to be one of the Americans serving there in Okinawa during that time. I think, you know, one of the things that I really love about your book that you have talked about tonight is this, you know, things can be a lot better. It sounds so corny, but just recognizing humanity, right, in the people around you is such a, I think, a really central part of what I took away from your book. So I really encourage people to read this book. It as Stan said, Okinawa is threaded throughout much of the book, and it's a wonderful read. It's beautifully written. Thank you very much, Stan, for sharing your time with us. I hope you'll stick around for the Q&A.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you
all for doing this. It's very moving to see.
Thank you, Stan. All right. Now, how about some music? So today, Koza remains a major music town. It's got a nice, rich history with music that predates, you know, that goes way back decades before the uprising. So let's hear a song entitled Chijuya, and it's by Wesley Uenten, whom we'll learn more from later, along with Francis Wong and Scott Oshiro. And they're playing a bevy of instruments, a hybrid of instruments, sanshin, sax, some other things. So it really kind of reflects possibly the hybridity of Koza itself. So if you need to get a tea or something, let's take about 5 minutes, turn up your speakers, let's listen to some music.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody had a good opportunity to stretch and think a little bit about what we've heard so far. I've been really so pleased to be hearing from Kuniyoshi-san and Stan speaking about their experiences so far. We're going to take the program back to Kubota-san and Kuniyoshi-san in Koza for some more reflections on the night itself. So Tomoko, are you able to come back on now?
Yes, I can.
Terrific.
Can you see me?
Not yet.
聞けますでしょうか？
さあ、それではですね、早速、コザ騒動
Okay.
が12
So December 20th, Koza Uprising happened, and I would like to see where it actually happened.
では国吉さん、ここからまたよろしくお願いします。
So Mr. Kuniyoshi, please take the floor.
発生場所の今の様子
Okay, so we would like to see how it's what it's like
はい
just now.
の三栄中野町店ですね。
So here, Sangay Nakanomachi, here you can see. So there's like a grocery store there,
ホテルっていうのがございまして、
and then we also have Kyoto Hotel on the street. And if you keep going straight,
金物店
and then there's like a
のお店はまだございます。
store. There's the same store that existed 50 years ago. So what was it like when you actually got here 50 years ago?
ですね、ホテルの前あたり
So during the uprising,
があるんですけど、
there's a traffic light in front of a hotel.
だいたい2時過ぎから
And then I think I was there maybe 2:30 a.m., maybe 3.
ちょうどもうその時には車が燃やされて、
And then when I got there, a lot of cars had been torched, and I can see black smokes coming up.
空軍のヘリが
And then helicopters sort of hovering over the buildings
デモ参加者
from the US Army.
参加者をもう照らすわけですね。
And then they were sort of
出てないと思うんですが、
um,
この
lit up the whole area with the lights, the headlights from the helicopters to see how many people were there.
動きが止まってしまうんですよ。それでこれサーチライトが移動するとまた走り出して。
And then as soon as people saw the searchlight from the helicopter, they would sort of be quiet or hide behind buildings or objects. So the whole town sort of becomes still under the searchlight. But in the dark, people are just waiting for the searchlight to go away. And then Mr. Kuniyoshi took some pictures.
これフラッシュは使って
In the dark, were you using like a flashlight from the camera?
焚いたら取り囲まれました。
Yes, I used it once, and then people surrounded me.
顔ですから。
And so, you know how I look like? So people thought I was a police.
いやいや違う
And I said, no,
マスコミの琉球新聞
I'm a journalist
という
from Ryukyu Shinpo newspaper.
焚くな
And then they told me not to use the flashlight because people didn't want their faces on my pictures.
防げたもんですから、お前国吉じゃないかっていうことで、
And then
じゃないから
some people actually recognized me
その場
as
これが
Kazu Kuniyoshi.
しょっぱな
So they felt sort of okay because they knew that I wasn't a police officer.
前の近く、三栄の近くですけど、この写真を待っておりました。
So I took this. This was one of the first pictures I took. And then you see all the flames.
希望で撮ってですね、
And then I didn't use any flashlight.
処理するという方法を取りました。
I used long exposure.
まだいくつか暗い
And
の
then
が写真ありますね。
you have, I can see you took some pictures, several pictures in the dark.
もう無駄になった
So
たくさんあったんじゃないですか。
もう
so you had some film rolls that you wasted. Yes, yeah, I didn't take pictures that were usable. So maybe like 1/3 of all the pictures I took that night were actually sort of good enough
行く途中にですね、
to develop.
上がる途中に
So here I was going down the street
そこに
and then I saw another car
二人この
and then you can see like two women
歩いてたんですよ。
walking by the car. And I use this as sort of like with a slow exposure. And then I headed towards the Gate Street. And then the US military, and then there's police there on the scene. So this picture, I think this was by the second gate. They were trying to block the traffic. They had middle six, and they sort of lined up, maybe 60 men lined up like a wall. And then you can see little stones on the street. And then those are from the, you can see sort of like a square tiles on, in Okinawa, they have those tiles on the street. And then the people would like rip that off from the street and then break them into pieces. And then I'm sure it took forever to break them into these smaller pieces to throw. And then some people told me to throw one. And then they were kind of big. It's not like a little stone. They're kind of big chunk of rock. So when I went behind them, I was a little scared and worried that they might actually arrest me for going behind the wall, behind them, human wall. But they didn't really care about me going behind them and take pictures. So the Koza Uprising, I think the situation was getting worse in Vietnam. And then, so all the soldiers actually came back from Vietnam or on the way to Vietnam. They stay in Okinawa and they have money. They just get wasted. They get drunk. And then, when these soldiers go into different bars and restaurants, local people who serve these soldiers don't really have positive experience with the soldiers. And then they were either bullied or abused or not treated well. So they were frustrated and stressed. And then the daylight comes in. This is early morning. And then all these cars with yellow license plates. They belonged to US military. And then back then, not many local people actually owned cars, but people took buses. And then as you can see here in this picture, there's really bad traffic jam on the street. This is probably 10 a.m., I think. And then by the afternoon, US military came to clear up the area and all of the burnt cars. And then so far, they said 80 some cars were burnt and torched. But some information actually says it's 108 cars or more. So I heard there are more and more witnesses and other information coming up now after 50 years since this incident. You can see this car is turned over and burnt. So there's picture, next one. I think it's the next one. This is the local people, right? You can see a lot of kids, small children, young children. This was probably around noon. And then you can see the barricades here with the wires. And then some people actually smile at the camera. Yes, they're smiley. Yes. I think they were actually happy. Here, this one, this was the one I was talking about. This says fire on sale. And then people are actually smiling here. What does this mean, this picture? So yes, you can see a non-Japanese person. So you can see how they dress and the hairstyle. You can see these are not military people or soldiers. That's obvious. They probably came. They're probably like tailors, maybe from India or some other countries. They came to Okinawa to make their clothes. And then, I think he's holding a sign written by possibly his Japanese wife. So a lot of non-Japanese people actually married. So they're teasing this whole situation. Yes, yes, you can see the young boy to the left. He's smiling too. So people from India, they had this feeling that they were discriminated against. Yes, I think so. A lot of them actually married to a local lady, local women.
Next slide, please.
And next one. This one, they look pretty tired. So these are the soldiers. They were probably standing on the street guarding gate 2 so people wouldn't go in military base. And then they were probably standing there for over 12 hours or so. And these people have to issue visitor passes for local people, local Okinawan people, when they try to go in to the base, Kadena Air Force Base. So local people with ID card, everything was burnt during this uprising, but I think they had to reissue their passes to go on the US base after the uprising. So this picture, she probably works on the base at Kadena, and she had no clue that this happened last night, the night before. And then she got there in the morning, and then she couldn't go in. She weren't allowed to go in. And she didn't know what to do. And I remember she was kind of trying to figure out how to get to work, what to do. And then this one, this is a boy walking on a car. And then I can kind of picture the scene surrounding this car and the boy. So this feels like just yesterday, but it's already been 50 years since this day. And I'm so worried that I have to tell the story as long as I can, so the story doesn't fade away. Our memories don't fade away. And then it's been 50 years since then. And then there was a student from Ryukyu University who's writing about Koza Uprising. And then this boy witnessed everything and then stepped on this car. And I don't think he would forget this day, this moment. And then I'm really hoping that this boy, this person, would share his feelings and his thoughts and his experiences from this day
やっぱり
with people around him. So
怒ったんだぞ、怒って一緒にし
we
て
can share that the local people in Okinawa, Okinawans, were angry
伝えてほしい。
and we did something about it.
彼と会ってみたいです。
And I am really hoping that I can see this person. And then I think, so all the adults around this car, I think all the men, the grown-up men, they probably wanted to, the adults, they probably wanted to jump on the car as well, just like this boy. But I think there must be this sense of relief, or maybe sort of like a pride that we were able to do this kind of sense. That's the impression I got. And then, so it's been 50 years. And then in the next section, I would like to talk about how Mr. Kuniyoshi feels about this event 50 years ago, 50 years later.
Hi, everyone. So as Tomoko and Alan just mentioned, I'm Lex. I'm a third-year PhD student in the history department at UC Santa Cruz. And I am super excited today to be yuntakuing with Dr. Wesley Uenten, who is a professor in Asian American Studies at San
あ、
Francisco.
俺ですか。
Okay. Wesley, cha ganju yamishemi.
ganju yaibindo. ganju yabisemi.
Ganju saibin. So one of the things I'm super excited to be talking to you about is actually we assign your book chapter about the Koza Uprising to our students in Okinawan history. And so one of the things that surprised me when I first, I stumbled upon this chapter in a book, not expecting it. And so I sort of wanted to know what your first time learning about the Koza Uprising was and what inspired you to write a whole book chapter about it.
Okay, I just must warn you, we have a 2-year-old, so she might have her own uprising at any time. We're in a small room in Naha. Anyway, going back to that article, and thanks for asking that question. It's an honor to be here with everyone. Let's see, the article, I had glimpses of pictures of what happened in Koza over the years somehow, and then it didn't come together until a friend of mine, Arakaki Makoto, who's here in Okinawa as well. He gave me this book about, it was a collection of photos of of Koza around 1970, and there's all these photos of that night of December 20th, and the aftermath, and what happened before that. And so I started thinking, wow, this is something it kind of had a great impact on me. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to write the article, it started out as a paper. So I got to UC Berkeley and got into the Ethnic Studies PhD program. And I was learning about third world liberation and imperialism, white supremacy, colonialism. And I was trying to apply that to the Okinawan case. And so I wrote this paper for one of my classes. And that's where it started. What I was trying to do was rewrite the narrative of what it means to be Okinawan in the diaspora, to be an Okinawan overseas. I'm Sansei Okinawan. And so the way we have written our narrative of what it's like what it is to be Okinawan is this linear trajectory, the assumption that our history is one of upward mobility leading to success. And part of that is we will reach success if we keep our head down and don't say anything, be quiet, passive, don't resist. I want, and feeding that narrative was this model minority myth that exists in the US regarding Asian Americans. But also when I was a kid, I watched this movie over and over. It's called The Tea House of the August Moon. And the characters in that movie were all these passive and happy-go-lucky, everything's fine. You know, that was the portrayal of Okinawans. So that's one reason why I wrote the article. And right around the time, sorry, I'm academic, so I can keep going on and on. But at the time, I met some of the Black Panthers in Oakland. So I was at UC Berkeley, and I got to meet Black Panthers. They're around, so I got to meet them, and we shared these stories. And I showed one of the former Panthers a picture of the Koza Bodo and pictures of Teruya, and he was really surprised. There was a picture of Huey Newton in there, and he went, wow, and he was shocked. And so that's some of the reasons why I wrote the article.
Yeah, I think sort of backtracking a little to what you were saying about these persistent narratives about what it means to be diasporic Shimanchu. Like I'm also diasporic Shimanchu. I'm mixed race from San Diego. And one of the things that I think was really pervasive growing up was this like peace narrative, peaceful people, beautiful island, peaceful people. And I don't think that has to be incorrect, but I think one of the things that the Koza Uprising shows us is that there is at least one big instance in which Okinawans just don't sit and take it anymore. And I think that's one of the big takeaways I have from your article in particular. And then you make it very clear throughout the chapter that the Koza Uprising was an incident with a bunch of factors, as we've heard, racial inflections, gendered inflections. And I was wondering if you could chat a little bit about these other circumstances going on in Okinawa and how that causes you to call it an uprising over a riot, as we've done here as well for this event.
Well, a riot assumes that people are not, it was a spontaneous, and it also kind of is, when you portray it as a riot, it's as if the people who are doing or partaking in the riot are animal-like. So it's, in a way, it's, you know, how we portray Black Lives Matter and other uprisings in the US. We, especially if they're by people of color, it's kind of animal-like. But if you really look at them, a lot of things are happening, and people are, it's been percolating for years, decades, centuries. And so in the case of Okinawa, there was a, if you go back, you can go back to 1609 or even further, and where Japan or Satsuma forcibly colonized Okinawa. And so there, from that time, there's taxation of Okinawans and exploitation of the Ryukyu China trade. And then you keep analyzing history. Okinawans are being oppressed and exploited over centuries. So I felt that all of that came together on that night. And it's oppression, economic oppression, social oppression, gender oppression, and the class oppression. It all came together in that fateful night, and it took an incident and it sparked it. But yeah, there were a lot of things, the causes and conditions were there that it just exploded that night.
So we're going to take a quick break from Wesley, Shinchi, and my conversation, and we'll go back to Kubota-san and Kuniyoshi-san, and then you'll hear from us again. All right, Tomoko.
Is it my turn? Yes?
Yes, it is, Tomoko.
Okay. Good. Can you see me? Okay.
見えますか?
さて、それではですね、国吉さん、改めてまたお
Okay,
願いします。
so now Kunio-san and I will talk about how we should think about this Koza Uprising after 50 years. So I'm going to show you where I am.
一応バーチャルツアーということでですね。
So I'm going to call it a virtual tour. And I hope you can sort of sense, you can feel that you're walking through the town of Koza.
現在私たちはコザにある戦後
So
文化
right now, I'm at the his street. It's the Post-War Cultural Memorial Museum in Koza. And here, this they have exhibit all the cultural materials, pictures. You can see all the pictures here, and then tools, devices, and then on the second floor, this is the special exhibition here, and then they have a Koza Uprising and the 50 years of history, and you can see the big map of all the incidents where they happened and accompanying pictures. And then I am in that building. So okay, so Mr. Kuniyoshi. So it's been 50 years since then. And then looking back, what kind of impact does this incident bring to the local people of Koza or people in Okinawa? It's difficult to describe. But so we have Japan, this is US, all these big, larger entities and organizations sort of put force and sort of weight on the shoulders of Okinawans. And then, so before there was a direct dialogue and conversation between Okinawa and US government or US military. So this was more like a direct interaction or negotiation. But now we have Japanese government in between. And then I sometimes wonder myself if our voice is actually being delivered honestly and directly to the US side through the Japanese government. And then now we can talk about things that we were not supposed to talk about 50 years ago, or we couldn't talk about 50 years ago. So now I think there's a change in our awareness regarding the issue or our stance. But throughout my life, it's 70 some years of the history, I think there's so many bases, and the US military can actually open up new bases whenever, wherever they want in Okinawa. And then I want everyone to remember that Okinawa is not just a place for US bases or other sort of purposes, but we live here. We're human beings living on this island in Okinawa. And then all these voices have been ignored and not taken up, not valued. And what I can do is take pictures. And then through my photographs, I can deliver my message, hopefully, and then get my message across through my photographs. And then I want to participate in different events. And I want to have my own voice to speak up. I want to communicate. Of course, I used to work for a newspaper company. So back then I was 24. So I would go interview people, take pictures. But then this incident itself really impacted and changed my life from that day. And then that was really a turning point for my life as a journalist, as a person.
ミュージックタウンで今日までやってま
And
すけど
then
ね。
here, there's an event for this 50-year anniversary since the uprising at the music town. I think today is the last day of the event, but you can participate if you're interested in. And then lastly, I think there are a lot of students in the States participating in this event. And then there are a lot of people, especially younger generations, they don't know anything about this incident. Do you have any message for these young students? Yes, people in my generation had a lot of sort of significant impact or influence from cultures in the States, from the States, music, movies, and they affected me in my life. And then, like, I don't have any sort of allergic reactions or sort of a feeling of rejection for anyone from the States. I want to get to know them. I want to talk to them more. And I want them experience this little island. I want them to know so that how many bases we have on this tiny little island. And I will welcome you if you want to come visit us here. So please come and see the reality here. Thank you very much for your time to join us today. Thank you. And then we're going to have a Q&A session.
Thank you so much. ありがとうございました。もう一つのコンバーセーションがあって、それはレックスとウェスリーさんの。
And then, so I think we're going to have another conversation with Wesley. And then after that, we're coming back to Kuniyoshi.
I can sure try. So one of the things you and I have chatted about a bit, Wesley Shinji, is that we don't really learn about the Koza Uprising in diaspora spaces. I grew up pretty Kenjinkai adjacent. We would go to the big Obon festival and New Year's, and I went to temple school for a while, but I didn't learn about the Koza Uprising until college. Did you have a similar sort of coming to?
Yes, I guess being putting in the context of Okinawans being colonized, and one of the first things that is greatly affected is language. So Okinawans have our language has been cut in a lot of ways, like Native Americans, and we've lost a lot of our language, and so getting messages across to the next generation is very hard, and getting messages across the ocean or from the homeland is difficult. So we spend we in the diaspora, Okinawan diaspora, we spend a lot of time trying to train our ears to hear the voices of our other Okinawans back home and in other parts of the diaspora. So it's a lot about voice. It's the voice of Okinawans. And the way I see the Koza Uprising, I don't mean to romanticize it too much, but it was a voice of love, love for yourself. It was part of the peace movement, the pain of knowing that Okinawa was used as a staging ground for the Vietnam War, and the voice of my daughter in the background. But it was a voice of love, and we in the diaspora are searching or trying to amplify our voices. A lot of times we're not heard. It is about this voice, and I just want to mention we have a group called the Global Uchinanchu Alliance. So if you go on Facebook or look us up, the Uchinanchu Alliance, and see the voices of some of us in the Okinawan diaspora. I have a friend named Pete Doctor who just wrote about the Koza Uprising. You can look up for him. And there's also Eriko Ikihara here in Okinawa. So if you look up Koza Mixtopia, she has an event on the Koza Uprising. So it's today. Anyway,
Right.
sorry, that plugs you.
Yeah, and they're both really inspirational to me as well, and citing them in my master's paper last year. Both of them ended up in there. I think on my end, now having been able to design a class about Okinawan history with Alan, Malaya, and Drew, one of the really important parts to get in there for the modern Okinawa section was about the Koza Uprising. And like you were saying, it provides a voice that I at least was not aware of when I was growing up. And I think the people who talk about the Koza Uprising in very real terms about what it actually was, which is like a decolonial movement and the result of so many forces of colonialism for so long, are people like you and Kuniyoshi-san who are also Shimanchu. And I think it feels like I wouldn't be doing my sukubun to not include these voices and this event like in teaching our students. And so I wanted to thank you for that. Did you have any final sort of words? Or I could go on forever with a Yuntaku, but
No, maybe just the song that Francis Wong and Scott Oshiro and I did called Chijuya. And so the meaning of that song is the diasporization of Okinawans made Okinawans leave Okinawa. And one of the only things that being so far away from home, knowing we can't really go back to where we came from. We can look at the moon in the sky, and there's only one moon, and we're wondering if the other people are looking at the same moon. So that was the meaning behind that song.
And with that, I think we will throw it back to Alan. Thank you, Wesley Shinji.
Thank you, everybody, all the panelists, for a fascinating discussion. We've had some great commentary in the Q&A section. People are really quite moved by a lot of what has been said here. And a number of people have asked about some of the materials we've talked about. For example, the essay by Dr. Uenten, which is in a book called Militarized Currents Toward a Future Future Decolonization of Asia and the Pacific. And his essay is called Rising Up from a Sea of Discontent, the 1970 Koza Uprising in US-occupied Okinawa. So that book was published in 2010. A lot of people asked about that one. I'm going to start with a question from Hiramoto Noriaki. This is in Japanese, and he's got one part for Kuniyoshi-san, and he has one part for Stan. So I'll start with the one for Kuniyoshi-san. 沖縄には基地問題がまだ残ってます。
So there's a base issue in Okinawa from a lesson from the Koza Uprising 50 years ago. What can we use? What knowledge can we use in order to solve this base issue in Okinawa? Is there any change in the relationship between US military and Okinawa in this 50 years? Were you able to hear the question? Should I repeat it?
Okay.
Okay, I can't hear you. Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay, shall I read the question?
Okay, I'm going to read the question again. So in Okinawa, there is a base issue, and based on the lessons learned from 50 years ago, Koza Uprising, I think the sound volume is really low. I can't really. Were you able to hear my question, Kubota-san?
まだ基地問題が基地問題は残っていますが、コザ騒動の経験から活かせる。
So we still have the issue of U.S. base in Okinawa, but is there any lesson that we learned from 50 years ago from Koza Uprising that we can use in order to solve the issue? Okay, is this my turn?
大丈夫ですよ。
Yes, go ahead.
あれ？
次ですね。今です
Okay,
か？
I'll wait. Should I wait? Okay, now, okay. So the base issue.
があります。
So there are so many views and viewpoints
アメリカ
for the
が
past 70 years. Okay, the easiest solution is US military leaves the base, leaves Okinawa,
政治とか外交
and that's the best.
ロシア
But
ずっとアメリカの基地があるわけですね。
because of the diplomatic issue with China, Korea, South Korea, North Korea, US military decides to stay in Japan.
それっていうのがあるわけですね。
And then, of course, you can see here.
いうのを沖縄の人間に向かって言うなら、
So if you're talking to locals in Okinawa,
東京とか大阪とか北海道とかに
I would say all these bases should go to other places in Tokyo, like Tokyo, Osaka, other cities, not in Okinawa. And this is such a small island. And then we have 70% of US military bases of all Japan on this island.
だから
It's
私
just so, they're all concentrated in here. So I want to tell all Japanese people that they should take over, and then they should be responsible in hosting US bases instead of us doing it all. And that's my view.
これははっきり申し上げますけど、
But yes, okay, let me be really honest.
ミリタリーであって反米では全くないです。
I'm not anti-US. I am anti-military.
そういうことで基地が及ぼしたその沖縄に70年
So that the 70 years, close to 80 years of impact
ほど大きいんですけど、
the US military bases
あの
gave to the local people of Okinawa and Okinawa, the land of Okinawa, we can't, it's unimaginable, unbelievable.
今アメリカと日本のやり方見て
So now I see how Japanese governments work, how US governments work,
とは失礼なことなんですけど、
and then
あんな感じなんですね。
the diplomatic issues. You can see
というふうなことが
how they work with each other. There are so many things I want to talk about.
このスタンドっていう
But here in this book called Stand, this is how I feel. This represents my thoughts.
There's another question from Hiramoto-san, this time for Stan. And it's in Japanese, but Stan, I'm going to translate it on the fly for you, okay?
Thank you.
So Hiramoto-san says, not many Japanese have learned about the pain of the American soldiers from that time. And so Hiramoto-san believes this is a very valuable testimony that you've given today. And he would like to know that there's a term bundan, which means, you know, the separation of Okinawa and America in terms of the rule by America. So wondering, what do you think has changed in the 50 years since the end of American rule in Okinawa? Do you have any sense of that?
You mean on Okinawa itself?
Either in Okinawa or even for yourself, if you reflect on the end of American rule in the early 1970s, what do you think might be the effect in Okinawa?
はいはい。
It's hard. It's hard for me to say what that effect is on Okinawa because I have not been back. I worked with Okinawan people in Hawaii when I was working and living there, so I have some pictures of it specific to Okinawa. But in the 60 years since I've been there, I think we have a much greater, deeper, broader opportunity to see the effects of colonialism, of US colonialism worldwide, and where this is affecting the entire planet right now is really important. I think Okinawa represents for me a kind of a microcosm of where militarism does damage to everything, to people's spirits, to the land itself, to where people's spirits are completely interconnected with the land itself. So I see huge changes in the last 60 years. I also see at the same time a stasis, a way in which people are refusing to see the obligations of being a human being. And as I was listening to everything here, I completely celebrate the Koza Uprising. I think it was, as the indigenous people of Chiapas said, basta, which is enough, okay? So I see that as a very strong resistance that I think should be studied. People should see this. At the same time, for me, as a Native person, as an indigenous man, everything I experienced from the Okinawans when I was there, 63 to 65, were very defiant acts of resistance. I don't see the resistance of Okinawans from my experience as solely being confined to that event. I think that's a beautiful symbol of it. But when I was chased out of that hotel because I was an American, that's an act of resistance. I did nothing personally to deserve that, but I was part of a body of people who were occupying that land. I knew nothing of it. I was 19 years old. I was just beginning to wake up to all this stuff. When the people in Nago hit me, what the Okinawan men coming in searching to beat up Americans was doing was an act of resistance. And the insistence upon maintaining the vision of life and community, the sense of community was so powerful where I lived on Okinawa and with the people that I met, and the openness. To me, that's an act of resistance because colonial powers want to stifle your relationship to life. They want to make you believe that life is a certain thing. And that certain thing usually involves violence and despair and fatalism. And to me, the act of resistance that I got from the people of Okinawa, which is why I thank them today, was to not bow down to that fatalism, but to keep believing in life as they had seen it for thousands of years.
Thank you, Stan. That's also partly an answer to a question from Takashi Mizuno about whether you viewed Okinawans as indigenous people when you lived there in the 1960s.
I did not. I viewed them as Asian people. But like I say, I barely got out of high school. So, and then I was in the military. So I had no real education on these issues. What I did know, as soon as I started moving into the community, there was one old man in particular who took me under his wing, and he was exactly like my grandfather. So I couldn't give the words to it, but I knew that he was family. You know, he saw the world the same way my grandfather did. You know, so the answer is yes and no, not in terms of articulation, but in terms of the heart, absolutely. Absolutely. I felt very much at home.
Thank you.
Very much at home.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Let me move to another question. This one is there's so many questions coming in, and they're all really wonderful. Let me move to one that Jim Ferris asks, and I'm just going to sort of paraphrase it a little bit. But I wonder if anybody participating, anybody on our panel could talk a little bit about the ways in which Koza as a base town differs or shares similarities with what we know of as other base towns. You know, I imagine a lot of people listening are familiar with a base town somewhere, right? We have base towns in the US, or base towns, we don't really call them necessarily base towns in the US. Lex, I know you're from San Diego, which, you know, I would call a base town. And so I think that I would just be curious that maybe we could think of Jim's question of you know, what that sort of base town differs, or how it looks similar to what Koza was, and maybe what Koza is today. There wasn't anybody in particular.
If we have nothing for that, we could move on and maybe come back to that a little bit later. This is a question that might be best answered by Kuniyoshi-san. This is in English, so I'll ask that it be translated. One of our visitors asks, were Koza police officers reluctant to defend American or the Americans or US military property? Were the police sentimental to the uprisers, or did they show brutality? And considering the uprising from the position of Koza's law enforcers, do we see any parallels to police in the USA today? You know, this could be for Kuniyoshi-san and maybe perhaps even Stan or Wesley.
So
I was there at 2 a.m. in the morning. And then when we have an incident like that scale, we have a special force from a police force. But that day, that morning, they didn't come to the public space anywhere at the second gate or Moromizato area. They didn't show up. So total 4,000 to 5,000 people were on the street that morning. But the special force, they didn't really control us. They didn't really regulate any of the behavior. They were maybe they were trying to sort of reduce the violence if it's extreme. So only for extreme cases.
Well, so I'll ask another one. This comes from Jane Lin, and this may be Kuniyoshi-san again. Is there a possibility that another uprising of this magnitude could take place in Okinawa today? What would be the mitigating factors if it did, such as continued military presence or mistreatment of the locals? Or if not, what would the current deterrence be to prevent this kind of uprising from happening again?
So this is my personal opinion. But in capture in Nago city, they use a landfill to use a really beautiful, pristine beach for Marines. And then Japanese government supports this. And then Okinawa people actually went against this, didn't like this idea at all, even before this project started. And then 1964, US military, US government actually wanted to push forward, but now Japanese government wants to see it through. So the amount of money that they're going to use to destroy this beautiful beach, coral reefs, why is it necessary for them to do this? So in order to stopping that might be one of the paths that we can avoid having a uprising or incident at the Koza level. It's probably impossible to solve these issues without actually asking US military to move away, retreat from Okinawa Island. So in Okinawa, if we have any issues, there's always something base-related, fences for US military. And then all these projects that kill our marine environment. I think if we can stop this, I think the situation on this island will change dramatically.
We have another person born in, raised in Koza, who would really like us to return to a conversation about the conditions of these bases in other places than Okinawa, so far as we know. And again, particularly the base town and base relationships. And I know, Dustin, this is also an area of research for you, but Wesley or Stan or Kuniyoshi-san, if anybody else would like to provide a little information for Takamine Miwako.
Oh. Takamine?
I could just, just thinking about this question of base towns, and knowing what we know about Koza then and knowing what we know about Koza now, I think that those sorts of conditions were not necessarily unique to Koza, and this reminds me of another question that came up about, looking at the racial dynamic of the riot, of the uprising itself, in that, in particular, it was white servicemen who were targeted or whose cars were targeted, and Black servicemen were not targeted in that same way. And that was a recognition that, a town like Koza, as an American-based town, right? It's an Okinawan community, but it was outside of an American base, that, along with American exports of commodities and music cultures and things like that, you also exported American-style racism. And so within Koza itself, the town was segregated, so that you had, right, establishments, bars, and eateries in neighborhoods that were segregated and patrolled by MPs to keep that segregation in place for Black soldiers in one area and white soldiers in another area. And that's something that you see in other parts of Japan, at least, and other places. You think of, if you go into Western Tokyo, for example, Western Tokyo is a place that historically had a huge amount of military bases, right? Today, there's still Yokota Air Force Base is in Western Tokyo. Tachikawa Air Force Base used to be another major installation there. But there are a lot of military bases in that area. And a lot of those towns and those base towns that grew up around those bases, or those sort of entertainment districts, had a similar kind of racial dynamic that you saw in Koza. So, Koza in some ways was not unique in perhaps in some parts of, in some ways of thinking about what its base town element was like. But of course, you know, as Stan has been talking about and other folks have been talking about, you put into that mix Okinawa's separation and distinction from mainland Japan and the history of Okinawans being, you know, set aside from mainland policies, mainland sort of rights and legal rights, then you get a sort of a different dynamic, so that Okinawans bear the brunt of occupation and base towns. But other people can that as well. These other, you know, other base towns.
I had a question for Tomoko, but I'm going to wait to make sure that Tomoko is able to hear it. I'm going to ask. I
see Lex is.
Oh, Lex, go ahead. Say, why don't you add something, please?
Yeah, I just had a little something to add on to what Dustin was saying about base towns. And it wasn't until I moved to Santa Cruz that I realized how heavily militarized San Diego is. And it's a very, like, it was normal growing up to not question why we have Camp Pendleton and Miramar and 32nd Street all in one place. And we are like a US city, so it makes more sense. But the reason I grew up in San Diego is not just like this random thing. My grandpa was, the last base he was stationed at was Camp Pendleton. And so I grew up next to Camp Pendleton until I was 7. And then we moved to South Bay. And like, I grew up with base access my whole life and didn't think twice about it. It wasn't until I started thinking more deeply about militarism not being this normal thing, and especially when I took Dustin's Okinawan history class in college, realizing that for a lot of diasporic Shimanshus like myself, like I exist because of the military bases. And so it is this really weird cognitive dissonance that goes on. But because of that, there's a reason I also grew up with a lot of mixed race Okinawan people in my high school and in my temple school. And I think that element of base townness is seen really, really, really in particular when you talk about comparing places in the US with places like Koza.
Thank you.
In this conversation, I'm thinking of the campus that Dustin teaches on. CSU Monterey Bay is where I went through basic training in 1962. And Seaside was a complete base town at the time, very much divided between blacks and whites. Now, I want to point out that too on Okinawa, at least in my barracks, when you say blacks and whites, you have a whole lot of Latino and Asian and Native folks in there too. And they were all part of the white contingent. So the blacks were completely separated off. And everybody else, including folks from Hawaii that I served with, all referred to, or not all, I don't want to over categorize here by any extent of the imagination, but to say that the black areas were called the bush or the jungle. And so you get that whole a kind of connotation that Dustin's talking about being reinforced by the MPs. You know, it wasn't that much different right down the road from us here in a certain sense. Of course, it's very different because it's colonized. It's right after World War II. You've got a whole nother dynamic. But what this brought up for me when Kuniyoshi-san said, let's move these bases to outside of Tokyo. Let's spread the military out. Why is it focused all on one island? And for me as an indigenous person, this raises the question of possible racism within Japan towards indigenous people on Okinawa, and how that then feeds into keeping Okinawa not only an American colony, but a Japanese colony as well. So I think these are important questions to ask. You know, we see them here. And when Kuniyoshi-san said that, spread it out, I thought about, okay, what has happened to Fort Ord, which is one of the major bases here with this whole base town, with the black-white dynamic, the racism, the classism, all of it, the gender issues, the rapes, everything that's part of that. Here, it's now a university, okay? So what could be done on Okinawa with that land, right? Here you have this gentleman, Dustin, teaching right down the street here in what used to be the bastion of militarism in our area. So I like Kuniyoshi-san's idea because it opens the imagination to what is possible. And again, that comes back to that is keeping the imagination open to what is possible is an act of resistance. That is really, really important. I want to emphasize that. So thank you.
Kuniyoshi-san, do you have anything you would like to add? 何か最後の言葉はございませんでしょうか？
今のお話の中でですね。
So in his remark, since I've been here in Koza since high school, and then there was a sort of a, I was walking through this area called Black Street, and when I was a little kid, there was a team only with African American soldiers, and the commander was Caucasian American. And then near the Okinawa City Hall, there was this area, fenced area, and then there were some black soldiers, African American soldiers there stationed. And then on my commute to school and home, I think so there was always this, I think we called it like a bush, but maybe like, you know, when there's Caucasian soldiers sort of mix in the group, there's conflicts, there's fights. So there were a lot of people, non-Japanese people coming to Okinawa for work back then. So in my elementary school, junior high, high school, so there's always a classmate with African American dad or Caucasian American dad in my class. But for us, it wasn't really like a special thing that, you know, one of our classmates has a non-Japanese dad. And then it's been 75 years since US military control in Okinawa. But if there's a child, you know, who was born, then, you know, we call them like a mixed baby. But we have, you know, those baby is now 75 years old, and the next generation is my generation. So if it's just countless cases of these mixed race children grew up in Okinawa. So because we were sort of exposed to different races on this island, we don't really have any strong reaction to non-Japanese locals in this area.
People have been patient to be with us for 2 hours of what has been for me an eye-opening conversation, and particularly the perspectives that we've been able to hear from tonight are ones that we don't often get to hear from at the same time. And so for me, the sense of dialogue between everybody here has been very powerful. And I'm very grateful to all of our speakers today, both our special guests and to our Okinawa Memories Initiative team members. It's been fantastic. Our Q&A has just a treasure of fascinating questions and comments, and we are not going to be able to get to all of them, but I believe that our plan is, since we are able to save these questions, we will be posting this video on our website, okinawamemories.org. And we will include in that posting both the pictures that Kunioshi-san took that he has given us permission to show everybody. And we will include some of the questions and the answers that we've gotten today. And I will share the comments and questions, particularly with the panelists to whom they were directed. So I think that I've called on everybody's good time for quite enough now. And so I'm going to say thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Lex, would you like to say it in Shimakutuba properly?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Kubota-san, thank you as well. We're gonna end the program with one more tune by Wesley Uenten and his friends Francis Wong and Scott Oshiro. So if you'd like to have a listen to a song called Toshindoi as we fade out. Thank you very much.
Toshindoi.
「
Thank you again, everybody. And I hope we can see you at our next event, which we will be announcing soon on the webpage and on Twitter. Wesley, your daughter was very good.